My curiosity has gotten the better of me in the last little while. I've spent some time looking at the myths of the UK. I grew up there, in London, in a pretty normal working class family and had a decent education, and then left for North America and Canada, Vancouver, in '66. So I've been in Canada longer than I have been in the UK. So I look upon the United Kingdom, or Great Britain particularly, with a degree of fondness, and I am so curious what led to a prime minister not even being there more than a month. I mean, it's just amazing the politics that are going on right there. Now, in the title, I mention Churchill, Winston Churchill. And the reason is that since the Second World War, there's sort of been a myth about Britain, within Britain, that they see themselves as an exceptional people because they did, in their minds, win the Second World War, that they did amazing things. All of that is actually true, in the sense that they used the Commonwealth and the aid of America, and then the participation by America to win the Second World War against the Nazi regime. But you see, they were actually sort of at a stalemate until they got the aid and the strength of America to win the Second World War. The illusion that I was brought up with, and the myth that I was brought up with, is that no, they didn't really need help. They were going to do it on their own, but the Americans came in at the last minute and claimed the victory for this. But of course, Britain forgot about Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the various other parts of the empire, or Commonwealth as it is called now, who contributed men, resources, money to help Britain win. In fact, its old British Empire pulled everybody forward and assisted Britain in winning. Now, when the Americans came, I can remember my father saying, they arrived at the last minute and took all the glory. Actually, thank goodness that the Americans did arrive, and yes, they deserve most of the glory, but not all of it. So here's the myth that was built, or at least I believe was built at that time, is that the British saw themselves as exceptional. And this myth of the British exceptionalism grew in stature. I was so surprised by Brexit. Now, why do I jump to Brexit? Because Britain joined the European Union for a very practical and sensible reason, that it was the second largest economic bloc and was right there beside them, and that they could participate and build a new political and economic bloc called the European Union. All went well, I think, and it benefited greatly. It became more industrious, it moderned, it got to sharing technology and people and language. And then suddenly, out of the blue, for me anyway, as an observer here, they wanted to get out. They decided to do Brexit. Of course, it was a sloppy politician and leadership that allowed that vote to pass. I mean, I can't imagine in my mind why did they jump out of the European Union, and they're still not finished with Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. What a disaster. What an awful, awful thing to do. I can't imagine. So I started to look at what the myth was that the British people carried in their minds when they made the vote, when they took the vote to leave the European Union. And do understand, it was less than a full 3% that the leave vote won. In fact, if they had really taken a deeper look, they wouldn't have won. However, they voted, and the politicians and the people said, we're going to leave. So what stirred them up? What myth told them that they were, better off without the Europeans, without the other 20 countries and different associations and alliances and economic strength and power of the European Union? What piece of, well, I'll say it, bullshit myth did they get into their heads that they were, they could do better on their own? Well, I put it down to actually believing that they were exceptional. They were still hanging on to the idea that they had conquered and created one of the greatest empires. Well, Queen Victoria is long gone, and the Victorian age is long gone. And the conditions and the way and they created the British Empire are not one to be proud of. They stripped India, they stripped Africa, they stripped New Zealand and Australia and Canada. They sent refugees, they sent prisoners. They did everything other than being a good, if you want, leader. They acted in the Victorian years as that they were the best. And that still carried over. Even when I was in school in Britain, we were told how wonderful the British Empire was. We were told how it built India, how in providing schools and education and railways and buildings and amalgamation, that it made India great. Whereas the actual truth is that they stripped the wealth and the knowledge and the power out of India and took it back home to the UK, into Britain. They were anything but good leaders. Historically, they were, well, how do I put it? Absolutely awful at what they did. And Churchill made one of the most disastrous opinions, one of the disastrous actions in India that cost millions of lives. So Winston Churchill is a really good example. Even today, in a James Bond movie, for example, they show the British bulldog painted in a British flag, resembling the same kind of smug look as Churchill. James Bond is standing on the roof of a building that was built in the Victorian era, looking out over the top of London, acting as if it is a superpower. But you know what? It isn't. It hasn't been since the mid-50s. It got even worse in the 60s. Germany grew from ashes to become eventually a united Germany. Strong, clean, powerful, made immense changes in their culture. They are absolutely admirable at the way that they dealt with their faults and their problems from being under the rule of the Nazis. Britain has never acknowledged that it was, in fact, part of the slave trade, even instigating and building and making millions, maybe in today's money, even billions of dollars out of the slave trade. They've never acknowledged it. Don't think they ever will. You should talk to Jamaica and the different parts of the world where they disrupted everything. However, that idea that they once had an empire, that they were an exceptional people, and that they could do better on their own led to Brexit. That's what I've been able to read. That's what I, in my gut, believe. And now they've just had a prime minister for so little time. It's hard to believe that it's possible that they had a prime minister that had to leave Liz Truss. I mean, just awful, awful show of politics. The entire political system is at fault for that. I mean, it's just dreadful. She wasn't even there long enough to, what? How can we say it? To even make a difference. They got rid of Liz Truss so quickly. They undermined her. The politics from Boris Johnson and all of his manipulations and control issues, his lack of integrity, showed completely. Not only did they elect her, but then they undermined her. And let's talk about David Cameron, who basically walked away from the idea of saying no to the Brexit, saying no to them. He walked away and let it happen. But of course, I'm kind of think that the European Union is pretty neat. It has affected my point of view, I'll admit. But I can't imagine, even on a practical level, why one would go to one's neighbor and beat them with a stick and poke them in an eye and say, I'm exceptional and I can do without you. That's one of the traits of modern leaders, is they get stuck in their own myth about what they are really. They're not in current reality, they're in some sort of fantasy land, and they use their position and their propaganda to convince other people that, hey, we can do this, we can bring home this. Capturing the wishes and the fears of the people that they're speaking to convince them to vote that way. Now, that's not a British problem. That's a problem of many places. In the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Canada, Australia, all parts of the world. Politicians tend not to be in current reality. They don't tell you what is as it is. They tell you what you wish for. In fact, they spend lots of money looking at what your wishes are and then project them to you. And then you think, well, yeah, they're going to bring this? Well, yeah. But as far as Brexit is concerned, I actually put the sort of responsibility on the above 50 group there. The group like myself who grew up post-war Britain in the 40s, 50s, and to a certain extent to the 60s, when the sort of internal belief that Britain was exceptional, that they won a war by themselves, when of course they didn't, and they and they couldn't go it on their own. If you look at the British economy and the society itself, and look at the way they are right now, Brexit has been an enormous mistake. It has cost people socially, emotionally, and financially. They're in a mess just because they believed a myth that never was really true. The marketing of the War Department in the UK in gearing up the emotional and mental status of the British people to fight and to fight and to fight was amazing. Yes, it worked. It created a whole generation of men and women that were prepared to dedicate their lives and their being to freedom, to the freedom of the Western world, as they said. However, they never stayed in current reality after the war. That was a deeply locked myth in the generation, such as my father and mother. My father used to go off to his wartime reconnections or celebrations where he would reconnect with his old friends or with war buddies or with the people who still thought that way himself. He belonged to the British Legion, and he would go down to the meetings and to the club, and he was always excited when he would talk about it. For him, it was a highlight of his life when he personally got to be part of a hero, and in the RAF and in Air Sea Rescue, he made a difference, and it was a big time in his life. It was a very difficult time for Britain, and not only did they survive it, but with other people's help, they defeated the Nazi war machine. However, that myth is not why you should leave Brexit, the belief that you are exceptional. Current reality tells us lots of things, but most people don't want to deal with current reality, don't want to deal with the idea that perhaps they're not as good as they think they are, and maybe things are a bit more rusty and difficult and, not up to par. So, the myth. We all have myths. The myth of Churchill and the great empire has crashed around the British people. It's so difficult sitting here in Canada. And of course, I live with the Canadian myth that we are nice people. We don't have this myth of exceptionalism, but we have this belief that we are nice, polite, social people. Are we? Well, we're just like anybody else. We're like the United States, we're like Great Britain, we're like Australia. So we're like the world. The world has some exceptional people. And societies and social worlds are very different from the minds of politicians. They often think that what they say is reality. They have to, in a way, when they're up on stage selling you and positioning you to vote for them. You have to ask yourself, should we ever trust politicians? I don't know anymore. Are there good leaders? Well, yes, there are. You can tell by their results. But often we don't let them create the results. So we have a conundrum. We have our own myths about our own society and the myths about the world. Very few of us live in current reality, the way it really is. So with that rather somber thought, I wish you well. I wish you great peace in your life. Love and peace, Jeffrey.